Well, good morning, and thank you for joining us here at Hudson Institute. My name is Riley Walters. I'm a senior fellow focusing on global trade and technology. Thank you for joining us for this, I think, momentous event. I think it's a timely topic. Trade is, I think, always, at least on my mind, I don't know about yours, but at least it's on mine. And so we have a special guest with us here today to talk about the Biden administration's trade policy. And her thoughts on that. Ambassador Susan Schwab, thank you for joining us. I'm just going to give her a brief introduction, and we'll go into some few remarks, and then afterwards we can open up for question and answers toward the end of the event. Susan Schwab, Ambassador, is the Strategic Advisor at Mayer Brown LLP. She is also a Professor Emerita at the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. Ambassador Susan Schwab served as the U.S. Trade Representative from 2006 to 2009, and the Deputy Representative the year before that. As the USTR, she concluded free trade agreements with Peru, Colombia, South Korea, and others, and launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. She pursued and settled trade disputes with various WTO members, including China, Canada, and the European Union, and engaged in negotiations at the World Trade Organization, APEC, and other regional and plurilateral settings. Ambassador Susan Schwab serves on the board of Caterpillar, FedEx, and Marriott. She chairs the board of the National Foreign Trade Council and is on the boards of the Conference Board and Business School for International Understanding. With that, Ambassador, again, thank you for joining us. We would love to hear your remarks and your perspective as someone who has worked in this industry on the Biden administration's trade policies.
So after you have listed all those affiliations, I have to start with the obvious disclaimer, which is what I'm about to say has absolutely no bearing on any of my affiliations, okay? So this is me talking, and I have, I think, earned the right to say what I think, love my affiliations, but this is not what they think necessarily. Thank you, Riley. I'm delighted to be here at the Hudson Institute and to talk about trade and trade policy. I'm going to just ramble a bit briefly about trade policy. In U.S. trade policy, this administration talks about a worker-centric trade policy. I see a lot of the worker part. I don't see a whole lot of the trade policy part. And I think that is critical as we are thinking about trade policy, and obviously U.S. trade policy and U.S. policy, foreign policy is sort of dominated by U.S.-China relations and big geopolitics. One of the biggest gaps that is apparent to me is our trade policy vis-a-vis the rest of the world and how that comes into play when we're thinking about U.S.-China relations and the extent to which our trading partners, non-China trading partners, see us as an ally in economic terms and trade business terms. The other, let's say, anomaly or discrepancy is some of the ways that I see the administration beating up on the private sector, the U.S. private sector. We talk about antitrust and some other areas where it is obviously no one will dispute the importance of workers in the U.S. economy. That's not just unionized workers. It is non-union workers. It's not just manufactured sector. It is also services and agriculture. But the implication that somehow you can beat up on the largest employers in the United States, you can preclude strategic alliances and M&A and somehow maintain a vibrant economy that employs lots of people and that is globally dominant is beyond me. So I see those two as sort of discrepancies in a broader foreign policy perspective. That said, I think trade policy, this administration's trade policy is a little better this year than it was last year, and was a little better last year than the year before, starting with a low bar. I'd love to see more innovation and more creativity. I would love to see trade agreements, God forbid, real trade agreements, and trade agreements that have trade in them. I'd love to see more interaction between the executive branch and the Congress on trade agreements. I think that is fundamentally important. And I believe the Taiwan trade legislation that came out of the Congress not that long ago is as much a reflection of a unhappiness on the part of the key congressional trade committees with the executive branch and the lack of consultations as anything else. Having spent 8 years of my life as a Senate staffer, there is no group more conscious of Article 1, Section 8 and the role that the Congress plays than members of Congress, particularly members of the House Ways and Means Committee and the Senate Finance Committee. And it is critically important that this administration be actively engaged. And I think last 2 points I would make, I'd love to see us more, and on that point, I think you can be a lot more creative. You don't have to have a traditional free trade agreement to have a trade agreement. On the other hand, you could be a lot more creative, and that includes the WTO. And so I'd love to see us more active at the WTO. If the WTO didn't exist, we would have to create it. It is a fundamentally important trade agreement. It is not perfect by any means. As someone who beat my head against the WTO wall trying to get the Doha round done, I can attest to the fact that it can be a miserable place to do business. On the other hand, it is one of the few multilateral agreements where you actually can have consequences for misbehavior. And I'd love to see us filing more cases, particularly against China. One of the biggest problems we have with the WTO is a massive non-market economy in a system of rules that were designed for market economies. And we should be calling China on it. And let me close with the thing that I will be watching most closely in the coming months is the recent EU decision to investigate Chinese EVs, Chinese electric vehicles, coming into the EU. And they are looking at anti-dumping countervailing duty, traditional anti-dumping countervailing duty questions. And that is straightforward, WTO consistent, and it will be interesting to see whether they proceed with that or whether they decide to get squishy about it. It'll be interesting to see whether China decides to go ahead and act as though this is somehow outside the WTO rules and gets aggressive about it and starts threatening European automakers in China. And it'll be interesting to see how the rest of the WTO members react. So I'm going to leave it there, but it could be quite fundamental.
Yeah. No, thank you. You've given us a lot to think about, and I certainly have a few other topics I'd like to maybe discuss as well, because there's so many aspects of trade that you even sort of alluded to. There's domestic things that affect trade. I think my first question, though, has to be on, you mentioned the Taiwan negotiations, and in my opinion, the negotiations, we have trade negotiations ongoing between the United States and Taiwan. This is maybe the closest thing we have to an actual trade agreement that's ongoing currently. But it's also, I think, one of the only initiatives that Congress has really shown the greatest interest in. That's why they passed this legislation asking for telling that they require oversight over these negotiations. And so I wonder, though, is this sort of this tug of war between the administration kind of taking the lead on these negotiations, respective of Congress, and then Congress saying, well, hold up, don't leave negotiations without us. Is that really, is that how you perceive the future of trade negotiations? Is that a good thing for future trade negotiations?
So let's separate the two issues. Is this anomalous because it's Taiwan? Mm-hmm. So I think the answer is yes, to an extent, it's anomalous because it's Taiwan. But it is also very much in keeping with the sort of push me, pull you under Article 1, Section 8 that I alluded to, where over decades you have seen Congress demand more consultations from the executive branch on the one hand, and the executive branch wanting more independence in its activities. And where does the line between negotiation and implementation exist? So in the case of Taiwan, when I look at the kinds of things that USTR has been negotiating, they're all pretty straightforward. That make a lot of sense to me. I don't know the extent to which they actually require legislation, but I suspect that the reason, that Ways and Means and Finance decided ultimately to push it is, one, they did not feel they were sufficiently consulted, and two, there is some latent dissatisfaction going back to the Trump administration, where the Trump administration had set out to negotiate some mini deals, for example, the one with Japan, that they did not go to the Congress for authority. So there hasn't been trade promotion authority since USMCA went through, and the Trump administration and the Biden administration have expressed no interest in going back to Congress to get it. And I'm not sure we're going to see trade promotion authority in its post 1974 version again. It was going on 50 years since trade promotion authority was initiated. But I could easily see variations on that. But neither administration has been inclined to do that, and both post USMCA have sort of been nibbling at the edges of agreements that they maintain don't require congressional approval, which is just not going to go over well with Ways and Means and Finance. And that is as much to it, that explains as much as anything, I think, that legislation. In the case specifically of Taiwan, though, I go back to the WTO and note that the WTO is one of the very few multilateral institutions where Taiwan is a member. And I think it's pretty straightforward to say that if we tried to recreate the WTO or create a new trade agreement from scratch, China would make sure that Taiwan was not a part of it. And again, one of the valuable characteristics of the WTO and APEC, I would argue, where you have economies that are members rather than countries that are members.
Right. Yeah, I always love the sort of the hoops we jump through with the language on that.
Members, contracting
Right.
parties originally, and then members or economies.
I have a sort of another question on the back and forth. Then some of it seems very sort of authority, putting down their stake, saying this is where we have authority. But I do wonder how much of it is also political, in the sense that my sense is that Congress doesn't really have a sense on trade. And it's sort of been that way maybe through the Trump years, and that's what allowed him to do so much unilaterally through the executive. And maybe the Biden administration is also taking advantage of this. I don't know if you agree with that, but it is my sense that, is there a way that Congress can be doing more, or that the administration can actually be the ones telling Congress to do more instead of just acting unilaterally and waiting for Congress to play catch up?
I don't see, if you go back through the history of US trade policy, Congress was, quote, in charge. Again, Article 1, Section 8, it is Congress. Congress was, quote, in charge until 1930, or until 1934, sort of culminating in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, where Congress said, okay, we're going to raise this tariff and that tariff and that tariff. And trade agreements, to the extent they existed, were treaties, very hard to get through. And most congressional action was sort of raising tariffs. It is really hard for 535 individuals to make trade policy. So post-1934, with the Trade Agreements Act, the Article 1, Section 8 became, was sort of translated into a bridge between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And the most effective version of that bridge came with the 1974 Trade Act and variations of that since then that sort of forced this partnership between the executive and legislative branches. Ultimately, it is the executive branch that is going to do the negotiations. But it has to be with active consultation with Congress and members of Congress that don't always agree with each other. Hence, Ways and Means and Finance have the lead, but you've got issues outside of the jurisdiction of Ways and Means and Finance. So when I was USTR, obviously I spent most of my time with Ways and Means and Finance, but I spent a lot of time with the agriculture committees, with the committees with responsibility over foreign relations, with the judiciary committees, so a whole variety of, with the banking, commerce, all of the committees that had an interest trying to explain what we were trying to do, and then quite frankly, having to adjust what we were trying to do based on input we received, knowing that at the end of the day, we needed a majority of members of Congress to vote yes on whatever trade agreement we submitted. So, and by the way, you've got advisory committee structures where you've got members of Congress and staff who are cleared for, and private sector advisors who are cleared for confidential negotiating information. I mean, we have the most open and the most transparent system of any country, and every country is set up differently for trade negotiations. Ours is clearly the most inclusive and the most transparent and the most open to input from a whole variety of constituencies. I used to sit down several times a year with the heads of a variety of unions, labor unions. Again, we didn't always agree, but we were very upfront in our disclosures, and they were very upfront with me where they were most concerned, so that I would be conscious of that, my team and I would be conscious of that in our negotiations, and I respected that.
You mentioned earlier the WTO, and I'm sure there's a lot of consultation that goes into that. I'm sure it's very fun. But actually, one thing that kind of pricked my ears up, what you said was about China and Taiwan and the WTO. And I think today there's much more of a geopolitical interest in trade. And for foreign policy watchers, the big trade issue for us isn't the WTO, it's the CPTPP, or what was formerly the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And both China and Taiwan are trying to get into this. The United States is no longer a part of those negotiations. And you were talking about with the WTO, if we tried to renegotiate, China would try and prevent Taiwan from entering. And there's a very real concern about this in the CPTPP. If China gets in first, and then Taiwan will not join. If China gets in, then the United States will never join. And of course, our Japanese friends want the United States back in the TPP far more than they would like China, and so I would love to hear your thoughts on, as one of the people who began the negotiations for TPP, what do you think are the implications of China and Taiwan trying to join? and the United States sort of sitting out. And maybe we consult with nations in an informal manner on this, but we're not in active negotiations to rejoin.
So I'll start with the obvious, which is the U.S. not joining the TPP was a dumb as dirt decision. So that's one. Two is running a trade policy that is built on the presumption that Hillary Clinton lost her presidential bid because of TPP is also dumb as dirt. I think we could have gotten into the TPP. I think Congress would have approved it. But it's really easy to second guess your successors, and it's really unfair to do that. So I got that off my chest. If China were to join the TPP, it would be sort of game over for us ever joining, because one of the things they would do is make sure we could never join. I would also add, though, that if the members of the CPTPP were, I'm going to use the word foolish enough, but naive enough to let China join, having watched China's consistent and willful lack of WTO compliance, if they were to let the WTO join TPP and think something would be different, I would really raise questions about the motivation there, because China is still not in compliance with its WTO obligations. So why would it become in compliance with a higher bar agreement like CPTPP? So whatever countries in CPTPP think it's a good idea for China to join ought to be asked, why aren't they filing case after case after case at the WTO against China that is not in compliance with its WTO obligations? For example, China committed, when it came into the WTO, to join the government procurement agreement. It's never done so. Never put forward a proposal that was anything that any other country could ever take seriously. So that's worth putting on the table. I'd love to see the U.S. be a member of the CPTPP. I don't see that happening, not anytime soon. But that's arguably that could be a nomenclature issue. I mean, it's what's in the CPTPP that's important to me, and that can show up in other agreements. Right. And those countries and us can be a party to other agreements. Right. And that's why I'm a big fan of plurilateral agreements that can be negotiated in parallel to the WTO, that can be negotiated outside the WTO. I just think we need to be more creative in our negotiation of trade agreements. And some of them will require legislation, and some of them will not require legislation. I think they all require active consultations with the Congress.
Yeah. And then for Taiwan to join, I think there's many members who would like to see Taiwan to join, but there's this tricky relationship with China accepting Taiwan. But
I think it would be terrific if Taiwan could join. I don't see, without China, I don't see that happening, because I think the CPTPP members would be cowed into not letting that happen. Taiwan and China joined the WTO at the same time. They're both members of APEC. China can be pretty heavy-handed.
Yeah. I mean, it's no coincidence when we launched our Indo-Pacific Economic Framework negotiations, the other big trade-esque negotiations that this administration is pursuing, it shouldn't be any surprise that, of course, Taiwan had its own trade negotiations separate from that, not necessarily for the United States, but for the United States trying to reach out to more potential members of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. That framework, though, so switching to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the sort of what's perceived as the American alternative to CPTPP, if you would call it generously. There are some questions, I think, amongst the negotiating members about the longevity of this agreement and whether that could change if a presidential if parties change within the White House or even within the Congress. And so there's a lot of questions, I think, internationally about the longevity and commitment of American trade policy these days without it having gone through Congress, without it having sort of something on paper that's not just within the White House, that's an executive agreement. And so I wonder your thoughts on how we can sort of build confidence with our international trading partners that America isn't going to flip-flop every 4 years, which many say we will, on trade policy.
I think it's a valid concern. I think it depends on what the provision is, right? So if it's built into you, if the provision that's negotiated is built into U.S. law, it doesn't have to be built into U.S. law in a trade agreement. Not necessarily, right? But if it's not built into U.S. law, if it's an executive order, yeah, someone else can come in and change it. I mean, that's why you have trade agreements, and that's why you want congressional approval, and that's why you want dispute settlement. And that's why traditional trade agreements, there's a cost associated with changing your mind and doing something different. Because in a trade agreement, you have given something up to get something. And if that thing that you paid for gets taken away, there are mechanisms to make you whole again. And if those mechanisms can't be enforced, what do you do?
So I think we're going to open it up to the audience now. So if anyone has a question you'd like to ask, please raise your hand, identify yourself, and of course, keep your question short and concise. We'll go with the gentleman right here in the middle.
Hi, thanks for speaking today. My name's Tom Ramage. I'm with the Korea Economic Institute. I wanted to ask a question about Section 232 steel. So there's still a quota on steel imports from Korea, and yet the United States seems to have a shortage of what would be electric steel for electric vehicles. Where is the future of the Section 232 quota, either within the Biden administration or successive administrations? Thanks.
Great question. As I said at the top of our program, there are a number of discrepancies in U.S. trade policy, particularly U.S. trade and environmental policy. And within that context, very much so within trade and electric vehicles. I think the use of Section 232 has been use and abuse of Section 232 in the Trump administration was an overreach, and it could have been accomplished. I mean, quite frankly, if personal take here, if Bob Lighthizer had been in place earlier, I don't think we would have seen Section 232 used the way it was. It just happened to be the tool that the then Secretary of Commerce and others could access. I suspect that Bob Lighthizer would have used more precise tools and more effective tools. The challenge, of course, has to do with in steel across the board, just as we've seen with solar panels and wind equipment, and we're seeing with electric vehicles, and the Europeans are seeing with electric vehicles, and we will see with electric vehicles. We're starting to see some Chinese electric vehicles show up here, even with a 27.5% tariff, is China's overcapacity, consistent, persistent, non-market effects of generous policy lending, and therefore overcapacity, and therefore overproduction, and they got to put it somewhere, and they dump it into the global market because the producers aren't and don't have to respond to market forces. So, arguably, if we wanted to come up to speed really quickly, and if you actually believed in friendshoring, Korea would not be one of the countries facing higher tariffs on a kind of steel that we need to get up to speed quickly. But as I said, there are discrepancies, and with this administration, if you look at decisions and how decisions are made, the environment is very important, climate is very important. Foreign policy interests are very important, US-China, very important. But there is nothing more important than labor unions. Now, I'm not saying labor and workers, but labor unions, big labor. And so you have to look at every single decision that is made through the eyes of what is the impact on big labor. And that explains a whole lot of decisions that are made. And some of them have better and some of them have worse impacts on other US interests and other US workers and consumers and foreign policy interests vis-a-vis our allies.
Right here in the front.
Hi, my name is Tori Smith. I work with the American Action Forum. My question is a little bit outside of your role at USTR, but I know USTR does sit on this group. So looking at outbound investment, really big discussion. I think that it is interesting on where the administration is going with the consideration of using capital controls and Congress. Would love to hear your perspective on how that plays into the overall conversation within the government. And I know this is a Treasury tool, but within the government about the proper role of government in looking at capital and what that means for trade policy overall.
So that is a brilliant question. It is rather outside my lane. I will answer as a sort of an academic economist, which is I just don't like government intervention in the market. I mean, I don't like government picking winners and losers. I don't like red tape. I don't like taxes, which is what tariffs are. That said, I do recognize that there are foreign policy imperatives that can require a government touch. And the question becomes, have you structured a system where you don't over-rotate? And I'm obviously much more familiar with CFIUS because USTR sits on that committee, and that's been around much longer. And certainly for the first many years of CFIUS, I would argue that CFIUS did not over-rotate. It was only a very, very small fraction of transactions and potential transactions that were impacted. On outbound investment, or let me continue with CFIUS because there's it's sort of analogous. The question becomes, what happens when you start having a chilling effect? And above all, what happens when your rules are fuzzy? I mean, the biggest challenge you have doing business in China, any kind of business in China, is their laws and their regulations are incredibly fuzzy, intentionally vague, so that at any given point in time, you are going to be in violation of one of their rules or laws or regulations, and you know that they will call you on it when they feel like calling you on it. I think that really hurts their economy and is increasingly hurting their, the foreign direct investment and the interest that businesses have in investing in China, whether it's inward investment in China, foreign direct investment in China, or domestic capital. And we're seeing that in the Chinese economy. I personally am not a fan of the Chinese model. I don't think the Chinese model works, and industrial policy makes me uncomfortable. You know, the dumping I was talking about before, that is just evidence of the Chinese model exporting their mistakes to the rest of the world and having a negative impact on the rest of the world. But let me go back to your question. To the extent that government thinks it knows better, I start to worry. And so I would just hope that in the administration of the new rules, it will be with a lot of study and with a light touch such that it really is the national security, it really is national security implication investment that is impacted in only that, and that there's a dialogue with the private sector. There's not enough dialogue with the private sector in this administration, quite frankly. In particular, and by the way, that's an overgeneralization. It depends on which agency you're talking about. But there are agencies in this government that just have total disdain for the private sector. And have no interest in talking to the private sector, and there's some that do. And there were conscious decisions not to bring private sector experience into this government, and it shows.
I appreciate that question. I really am fond of the outbound investment issue. It requires its own event, personally.
It does, and it's a very hard, you know, my instinct is, why are we doing any of this? But there is a there, and the question becomes, how do you educate potential investors on the national security implications? What happens when the impact of US policies just proliferates into other countries, or funding coming from other countries, right? Or being generated out of other countries, just not being generated out of here. I mean, there are a whole lot of knock-on effects that I know have been discussed and will need to be considered very carefully in the implementation.
Yeah, we saw this around the G7, and I'm sure it's similar with trade policy, maybe in your experience, but once the US starts doing something, then we start going to our partners and allies and asking them.
But I thought the G7 statement, I was very impressed with the G7 statement. I mean,
on economic security?
On economic security. A lot of credit to the hosts.
Yes, absolutely. Any other questions from the audience? Let's go right here in the back row.
Hi, I'm Jenny Kai from the JAMA, Japan Automobile Manufacturers Association. And so I was very intrigued by your comment about what you're watching very closely on China and EVs and anti-dumping. So I'm curious, should they go through with this, the EU, what do you think are the implications for the US? I know that in Congress there's a lot of consternation about battery manufacturing here and Chinese joint ventures. So I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, as I said, I'm going to be watching it really closely. I don't know how it's going to play out. I think we're just looking at another avalanche of Chinese overcapacity ending up in everybody else's markets. Right now we're seeing, if you go outside the US and the EU, particularly some emerging economies, you will see Chinese vehicles, non-electric vehicles, whose names you have never heard of, dominating those markets and arguably being dumped into those markets. Now, one of the things that the WTO dump countervail rules do not address is third country dumping and subsidization. Even though it means that that US auto exports or Japanese auto exports or Korean auto exports to the rest of the world are getting totally decimated because they're competing with non-economic exports that are being dumped. There isn't currently a remedy for that. And that's the case, that's the case with steel, and that's the case with Huawei, and that's the case with, you can go through the whole list. In the case of EVs, we're sort of at the front end of that wave, but the Europeans are seeing it already, and they have a 10% tariff. The US has a 2.5% tariff on autos, as you know, but that's now, it's now a 27.5% tariff because of the 25% Trump tariff. And there's still at least one or two brands of Chinese EVs starting to come in to the US that I've seen advertised, which kind of blew me away because there is, to my mind, absolutely no way that can be done economically. But I don't know, maybe I'm wrong. How does it play out? Well, first, it would be interesting to see whether the Europeans go through with it. Second, what the Chinese reaction is, whether they go through it's a WTO consistent process the EU is pursuing. In terms of EV production and EV batteries, my hope is we don't over-rotate in terms of inward investment, which is to say, you're either in a hurry to get it done here, or you're going to wait until we can do the entire supply chain here ourselves. And this, again, is an area where I think sometimes the administration gets caught up in its Maslow's hierarchy and slows things down, as opposed to turning to friendshoring or nearshoring, or even letting in some foreign direct investment, even if it's from a Chinese battery or battery parts manufacturer. I mean, I am not an expert in this. It just strikes me that you're either in a hurry or you're not in a hurry. And there is a balance between speed in having an indigenous capacity to produce EVs. I mean, one could argue the direction we should be going in, I mean, this is just totally off the wall, is hybrids and not EVs. I mean, hybrids would make so much more sense for the US, right? We produce it's hard to get Americans to buy into EVs so far. We haven't gotten to the tipping point. We don't seem to be near the tipping point because Americans drive such distances and would kind of like to have a combustion engine and be able to put gas in if you need gas. Hybrids would work for that. I think you'd get much more uptake from Americans for hybrids. And oh, by the way, we produce hydrocarbons. And we wouldn't be dependent on anybody else. And then you'd have more time to build up your capacity for EVs. But that train, I think, has left the station. And ideology has overtaken what might have been a different path. But again, I'm not in a position to judge whether they've done the right thing in terms of speed versus practicality, but I question that balance. Let's put it that way.
Take one more from the audience right here in front.
Good morning. You know me, but nobody else does, so I'm Barbara Bowie Whitman. I'm very much with you on plurilaterals, and we've known that forever. What struck me in the withdrawal from TPP was that it might have been motivated by a sense not just of some of the things we've already covered, but a sense that somehow the U.S. could get its way better if we dealt one-on-one with countries instead of dealing with a bunch of them. And I think that might have been more appropriate when we dominated the world economy more than we do now. And that's just sort of my feeling on, if you believe that if you sit down at the table one by one with countries, you can get your way more often. In my own experience in negotiations, I learned, for example, that we were doing better once we started with the Central Americans at achieving some broader objectives within the dream that never happened, which was the FTAA. So I just wonder if you think that motivation is involved, the sense that we shouldn't do plurilaterals and let's do all this stuff one by one because we can get our way better. I think it's wrong, but do you think that's what people were thinking?
So on that, I would say that was clearly what was articulated by the Trump administration negotiators. They clearly felt that way. I don't sense that the Biden administration necessarily buys into that. I just don't think they want trade negotiations. I think they're scared of trade negotiations. I think they're scared of trade agreements. I think they're scared of, scared may be the wrong word, that may be too harsh. I think they're scared of trade agreements and negotiating trade agreements. I don't think they want the incoming. I think they've got other priorities, and this is not one of them. If they were to negotiate a US-UK deal, I suspect they could deliver on that. That was one that even that was one the Trump administration was looking at, or a US-Kenya deal. But you'd have to go to Congress to do a robust agreement like that. That said, we are, and they are, this administration is working on plurilaterals. Depending on your definition, I take a pretty broad definition of plurilateral. There is a digital trade agreement being negotiated at the WTO. It wasn't necessarily launched by them, but you've had e-commerce being negotiated. You got some services things being negotiated. The trade facilitation agreement that was negotiated before they came into office has shown how effective a plurilateral agreement can be. At some point, I suspect we will start talking about plurilateral, sector-specific or function-specific, multi-country, meaning plurilateral deals that may not be in the WTO. If you can't get a high standard deal, if you can only get a lowest common denominator deal. And you try negotiating it at the WTO and you've got some naysayers who are going to take it down to the lowest common denominator. The fisheries subsidies agreement, I mean, we tried to get that done. We couldn't deliver on that. This administration delivered on a deal. I'm a great fan, by the way, of WTO Director General Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. I think she has gotten to Geneva and she is kicking you-know-what and taking names. And they got that deal done. I think that deal is way unsatisfactory, but it's a beginning. I think you should start with some of those, and if they continue to be lowest common denominator, consider taking them outside of the WTO and start talking about non-MFN deals. Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah. You mentioned earlier this administration, I think, or just trade negotiators in general should start being more innovative. And I think, even the current ambassador, Tai, has talked about we need new trade approaches to trade. I don't know if she means the same thing as you, but I wondered, you were just talking about finding alternative methods to negotiations. But as a final thought, and any other final thoughts you may have, what are maybe some of the innovative ways we can approach trade going forward?
So I've actually mentioned a couple of them as we've been going along. Plurilateral deals in parallel with the WTO,
Sure.
Considering non-MFN versions of that, which would be heresy. in a more traditional trade context. Looking at trade promotion authority and sort of rethinking how you write it and how it looks and how the relationship between executive and legislative branches work in the context of trade promotion authority. I got some ideas on that, but I don't know exactly how it would work. But that would be a dramatic change since 1974 when the first Trade Promotion Authority bill went through. That's a second example. I think something we should have been doing all along, which is something that our administration did and the Bush administration, the Obama administration did, which was calling China on its WTO inconsistencies on a regular, systematic basis, which is file the damn cases. And even though they can get appealed into the void, I don't care, just get it on record. China is maintaining that it is a good citizen of global rules and institutions. And the fact is, it is not. And countries are not going to believe it when we say it. But if China keeps losing WTO cases, that is evidence that it is not. And oh, by the way, we should probably do a little better job ourselves of being compliant with the WTO.
Maybe a little. Well, Ambassador Schwab, thank you for taking the time out of this rainy morning to join us here at Hudson Institute for this, I think, important event. Hopefully we can have you back here sooner than later. But again, thank you very much.
My pleasure.